So the next session is going to be KOLs and patients, and we're going to talk about clinical trials. So if the group could come forward and find a chair, it'd be great. You can see, if they could put up the slide. I'm not going to do formal introductions because we only have an hour, but Christine Lovely, Hatim Husain, Stephen Liu, and Tom Stinchombe, and plus our very own Emily Venanzi and Jeff Sturm. So thank you all for agreeing to be a part of this adventure here. I have one introductory slide before we get into the discussion, and I want to remind you from all the things we've been talking about for this weekend that clinical trials are a centerpiece, and there are basically two main categories of clinical trials, and the first one we call non-interventional or observational. So the giving of the blood samples you did is considered a non-interventional trial because we're not giving you a therapy to test. There are, as Sadia showed yesterday, and we're going to post these up on our website, there are 6 trials that are available to you and that don't require you to travel, don't require you to take a drug, but that might be a skin cheek sample for DNA, or might be a blood draw, or might just be collecting your history and understanding what your life journey on ALK inhibitors is. So we really would hope that the majority of people would be able to participate in one or more of those clinical trials. Then there's interventional trials, and here's where it gets complicated, and we're going to talk about that with our experts. Because there are trials for when you're diagnosed, when you're at maximal response, when you're stable, when you're progressing. There are trials designed specifically for ALK patients. There are trials designed not specifically to test new agents that might be valuable. And depending on where you are in your patient course, one or the other might be appropriate for you to consider. And when you think about clinical trials, and I'm sure we'll discuss this in our discussion, deciding on clinical trials is not easy, and that's why we're going to spend this time on it, because what trial you consider depends on, well, what's your clinical state? How's your liver working? Have you had any prior lung inflammation? What data is available? Most of us don't want to go on a trial where, they have no idea about its safety or toxicity. But in some cases, that might be what you choose because that's the best opportunity. Your cancer status, are you progressing? Do you have progression in the brain or liver or other places? Personal factors, we know, maybe that should have been number 1 on this list. We know that having to fly across country or travel 6 hours to be on a clinical trial where you have to go on a regular basis is not practical. And so one of the reasons, as Sadia showed yesterday, we're trying to map out where most of you live and try to see if we can't get clinical trials close by, so at least you have an option within an hour or 2 of where you live. Then it depends on the drug development phase. Sometimes they're phase 1, sometimes they're phase 3, and then of course the toxicity profile, which we've been talking about at this meeting, is really important. So those are just some of the factors, and I'm sure we'll touch on those in a few moments. The plan for this hour is first Emily and Jeff are going to talk about why they went on a trial and what their experience has been. And then we're going to then use that as our framework to ask a series of questions to our experts about how they decide who they're going to suggest a clinical trial to and why and when. So with that introduction, we're going to start with Emily Venanzi.
Thanks, Ken, and thanks to everyone for being here at this great summit. So I am an ALK patient, and I was diagnosed in 2017 with stage 4 ALK positive cancer. And in 2017, the treatment landscape was pretty different. The options were not the same as today, but I think kind of my process as I was diagnosed and deciding on my treatment and eventually deciding on a clinical trial is still applicable today. when I was diagnosed, I didn't really know much about lung cancer and how the treatment had really changed. I thought, oh, I was going to go on some harsh chemotherapy and that would be it. But fortunately, I was quickly proven wrong by my local oncologist, who told me about targeted therapy and mutations. I didn't even know at first that I had an ALK mutation. When I first found out I had lung cancer, I knew it was stage 4, and the biomarker testing was still coming in. But I knew enough about advanced cancer that I knew that clinical trials were a way to get the newest and best treatments for a bad situation. So I was diagnosed at my local hospital, and then I told the oncologist there, I'm interested in clinical trials. So she said, well, why don't we transfer your care to the main hospital, which was Mass General Hospital, where they have a lot of clinical trial options. So that's what I did. And so after one visit locally, I started to see Dr. Shaw and Dr. Lin at Mass General. And I want to recognize, first off, I'm so fortunate to live where I do and have access to such a great medical center really locally. And I know that's not the option. I mean, not possible for everyone. But I do think it's important, if possible, to be seen at a more advanced cancer center where they have oncologists who specialize in lung cancer and in clinical trials, so you can increase your options if possible. So I met with first Dr. Lin, who was at that point training under Dr. Shaw, and she was the one who told me I was ALK positive. And she said, we have a couple of clinical trial options for you, in addition to the other possibility, which was going on alectinib, which was at the time had just been approved for first-line treatment. And so the options she presented were one, which was the CROWN trial, which was a big trial testing lorlatinib against an older drug, crizotinib. And the other option she presented was a smaller trial that was just at Mass General, combining alectinib, which at that time was the new best drug, with another drug that was already approved, FDA approved, for melanoma. And the idea was taking this second drug might help keep the alectinib working longer. And there had been some laboratory studies showing this, but they hadn't really done this combination yet in people. So it was a tough decision, but I ended up, I was concerned with the lorlatinib crizotinib trial. There was a 50-50 chance that I would be assigned to take crizotinib. And at that point, we knew that crizotinib didn't work as well to protect the brain, especially. And I didn't have brain mets at the time, but didn't want any. So I decided to rule out that trial and go with this smaller combination trial. As part of my decision-making process, I also sought a second opinion, and just to find out whether there were any more options. And again, I was fortunate to be in Boston, and I could go see Dr. Mark Awad, who at the time was just across town at Dana-Farber. And he agreed with the opinion of Dr. Shaw and Dr. Lin. These trial options were both pretty good ones. And so the decision ultimately was up to me. And I do have a background in science, so I think that helped me a lot to understand the options, and I could see how difficult it would be for people that don't have any scientific training to suddenly have to learn about these drugs. And I think the more you can get advice from people who may be able to understand the scientific language a little more, the better. But I think also one thing that Dr. Lin did when she was first describing the trial options to me was to write everything down, even draw some pictures to try to make it as clear as possible what these trials were and what I was deciding between. So I think if you don't understand what the options are, or really what the differences are between the standard treatment and a clinical trial, be insistent with the oncologist, and keep asking questions until you really do understand what the options are, and whether a clinical trial is right for you or not. So I know this is going a little long. I don't know, Ken, I was going to talk a little bit about my experience of being a trial participant. I first had to go through screening, so that meant getting my blood tested, making sure that my liver, my body was functioning well enough to tolerate the drugs in the trial. And that was a little stressful because my liver function was not so great. I'd been having a lot of pain with my cancer, and so taking a lot of Tylenol, and it really made my liver function impaired for a while. So I had to wait and wait a couple weeks until that improved. And at the same time, I wasn't on any treatment, so I was starting to feel worse. So that was a stressful time. So that is a bit of a drawback of a clinical trial, is sometimes you have to wait through a bit longer screening process versus just going right on to a standard drug. And at the beginning of the trial, I had a lot of visits. So I was going in at the beginning every couple of weeks to the hospital to get my blood tested and to check my heart, and I had to get an eye exam, a few more tests than I would have had if I had just been on a standard treatment. But at the same time, I felt like I was really being well looked after and well cared for, and so I think it was also a benefit that there were so many people keeping such a close eye on how I was doing. And as I've gone along, the visits have spread out, and now I kind of go at every 3 months or so, like I would if I were on a standard drug. And I just want to end with saying that it's a bit unusual that I went on a trial as my first treatment, and I met somebody just yesterday who did the same thing. And so it is an option to consider at many different points in your treatment, at the beginning, when experiencing progression, and also sometimes trials come up and we're starting to work on some that may be for patients who are stable at that state, like we were talking yesterday about minimal residual disease. So it's important for patients to stay informed about what their trial options are, and Ken will talk a little bit more about how you can do that. But always keep clinical trials in mind, and it could be for you the way to get the best treatment. And so just to let you know, I'm still on the same trial 7.5 years later and doing great. And so maybe I'm just having a great response to alectinib, but it could also be this combination. And so I'm happy with the choice that I made. And thank you all. And now
sit next to Jeff for the. It should be on. Come on all by itself.
Okay. Good morning, everyone. I hope my voice is working for this. So I've been on a couple of clinical trials. The first one was all the way back in 2015. So I was diagnosed in 2014 on New Year's Eve day at about 4 o'clock. We were on our way out to go dancing that night. And my wife and I looked at each other and said, "Do we really want to go dancing?" And my wife went, "Yeah, we sure do. Let's go." So we did. Nobody there at the party knew anything about what we were going through, and that's pretty much been the way it's been all the way along. So back in 2015, nobody knew in the local clinics pretty much anything about ALK positive at all. And the docs, before I was even diagnosed, asked me, let me get my head together, hold on a sec. So I went through about 32 days of radiation to begin with, and by the end of the radiation, they knew I was ALK positive, and I went on crizotinib. So that worked great, and I was NED within 90 days. But in September of 2015, I got a brain met, and sure enough, had to transfer to something else. Well, no one knew anything about ALK positive where I was, and other than crizotinib, And I got on a forum that was a precursor to the latest Facebook forum. And I just put the question out, what do I do now? And a very kind gentleman from Louisiana said, give me a call, I'll tell you how the game is played. So that was kind of my language, you know, okay. So he says, you can't do at this point with the local oncologists because they just don't know. You need to talk to one of the key opinion leaders, which turned out to be Alice Shaw and Ross Camage. So sure enough, I got on the phone with the administrator for Alice Shaw, and he said, come on back and let's talk. Well, at that particular time, we didn't really know about my chart, and we didn't know how to get our scans together. So that was a little bit of an awkward pause. So it took me a couple weeks to get all that together. And I'll come back to that particular issue, but I went and saw Alice, and she looked at all my records and everything else. She said, there's a new drug called alectinib in trial at the very end of the trial, and you can get on it, and there's a clinic right near you in Northern California where I live. It's about 70 miles from my house. And sure enough, we went out there and talked to the people, and the process of the trial itself was really simple. I mean, you just showed up, and I met with the doctor once, only once. It's the only time I saw him was the first meeting, and then was treated in the first session by a PA and the trial administrator, two very, very sharp women. And I mean, all they really did was take my vitals and give me my pills and ask me a lot of questions, and that was that. I was done in a couple of hours and turned around and went home. Now, in the alectinib trial, the original, this was the very end of that trial, the expanded access portion. This is lorlatinib head. Excuse me. Okay, many of you understand it. It's also pemetrexed head. So the expanded access was over in December. So I was really only obligated to go there 3 times, and then insurance picked up the drug. And January in 2016, I was off and running. That lasted all the way with lorlatinib, all the way up to first quarter of 2023, when my tumor markers started going up. If you all don't know about the Camage tumor markers, I would encourage you to look up Camage tumor markers. There are 4 tumor markers for 3 of them for other different kinds of cancers that if one or more of those is elevated, then typically you're due for a progression at that particular time. And I've been using them for a long time, and they've proven correlative for what I have. In any event, I had an abdominal tumor in March of that year, of 2023, that tested positive for a double mutation. So here we are, all the way down the road, knowing that lorlatinib was probably the drug for me. It was in phase 2 trials, but we were able to zap that tumor all the way to the end of 2023 when I got 2 tumors in my chest. They also tested for double mutations, but the end of phase 2 trial, the phase 2 trial for lorlatinib was imminent, and it eventually closed, so I couldn't really get into that trial. And we worked with it into January when I got abdominal tumors, peritoneal carcinomatosis, which is pretty serious stuff. If it spreads to the lining of your stomach, the symptoms are pretty severe, no 2 ways about it. So I had from January to March, it turned out, to wait to get into that trial while I was sick as a dog and getting sicker. But in March, again, got into the trial, and the drill was very much the same at University of California, Davis in Sacramento. It was 70 miles from the house, and the doctors there were great. Dr. Jonathan Reese. I saw him all of maybe 3 times in the better part of a year that I was there. Treated by the physician's assistant and the trial coordinator. You go in, they take your blood at 8 o'clock in the morning. By 10 o'clock, the blood tests are evaluated. You come in for a meeting, they ask you a bunch of questions, poke and prod like they normally do, and make sure you're fine and send you home. And those were the meetings. It was easy, except for the driving, which was somewhat problematic back and forth in that corridor. The good news is I got better really fast. I was up and out of bed and ride my bike within 90 days, 60 days, 90 days. The problem with that drug for me was that liver enzymes were much elevated. And, it involved multiple drug holds, and then I came back to it, and then they lowered the dose, and then I came back to it. So by the time we got to the lowest possible dose of 50 milligrams with liver enzymes, it didn't work. So I was on it till September, which is, 2/3 of a year, if you will. And I was very unfortunate because I didn't have any side effects from it. I felt great. It stabilized the disease, which never stopped. But it was a lot of driving back and forth. At first it was every week, and then it was every 2 weeks, then it was every 3 weeks, which was great. But then you'd have one slipping in for an extra one for scans, or if there were side effects that I had to deal with, I had to go in. There were 2 days where I had to sit in a chair in the infusion room and get electrocardiograms, where I was there for like 6 hours in a chair. Those were the 2 hardest days, and that was the hardest part of the whole ordeal. But the mechanics of a clinical trial are really straightforward. I mean, you go, they take your blood, they ask a bunch of questions, they give you your pills, and you go home. And it's as simple as that. So in September of 2024, that was it for the liver enzymes. I've gotten down to 50 milligrams, and they told me I couldn't stay on the trial. So those are my 2 trial experiences, and I appreciate the time. Thanks.
Thank you, Jeff. So we just heard, and Jeff, I think we'll skip over the conclusion slide because you did such a great summary there. 2 very different experiences, right? From first line, and then Jeff's being on both the alectinib and the Nuvalent trials. So we're going to go now to talk with our oncologists, and we'll just to kick things off, since Stephen is sitting close to me. Stephen, who do you recommend trials to, and when?
Yes, so we recommend trials when we think the trial is a potentially better option than the standard treatment. And so we know the standards of care, that's part of our training. We have trials, and if we think that those could be better, then we discuss it. Now, there are a lot of patients that, for whatever reason, wouldn't be eligible for it. And then it's sort of a different setting. But if patients are well enough, don't have other comorbidities, trials are often the best option. And really, I agree with what Emily said. At every point in therapy, there's a lot of work that goes into a study. There's a lot of cost expended, a lot of people working behind the scenes. And I think that when my colleagues and I are finished with clinic and all the administrative responsibilities, the extra work we do, often at night and the weekends, is working on the clinical trials. And so we only will open a trial if we think it's worth it. So every trial that we decide to open is a trial that we believe in. And if we don't believe that that's better than the option, we're not going to go through the work of opening the study. And so we open a trial that we believe in, that we think is better, and then we outline the different options that are out there. If we think it's potentially better than standard treatment, we'd recommend the trial.
I'll jump in. Hi, everyone. Good morning. I'm Christine. I will just start by saying there will be no treatments new if there are no clinical trials, period. No new treatments without clinical trials, period. So if we want new treatments, we need clinical trials. That's it. That's how we get new treatments. That's why we have first-line lorlatinib. That's why we have first-line alectinib. All of these things came from clinical trials. That's how drugs go to FDA for approval. There is an enormous number of questions here. This is such an important topic. I think it is important to know the nuts and bolts. What are the challenges? Because, I often think like, well, why don't we have more trials and why aren't they more geographically dispersed? And sorry to digress from the question a little bit, Ken, but I'm gonna just jump in and say, what sometimes doesn't transmit is like the unbelievable infrastructure that goes into a clinical trial. And that infrastructure is difficult to put in place, and that's why there's not clinical trials at some smaller centers. That's why clinical trials tend to be at the big centers, and Emily said it so well. The bigger centers tend to have clinical trials more because the number of people, you may be seeing your physician team, your physician, the APP, but there's probably 50 people for you as one patient on a clinical trial who are looking at every aspect of that trial. So one important message that I want to emphasize is the level of diligence that goes into the care of every patient on a clinical trial is immense and unbelievable. This is not like you're a guinea pig. A lot of patients are concerned about that. The level of oversight that goes into a clinical trial is unbelievable, intense, and it requires a village, and a lot of those people you are never going to meet or see. And so I want to acknowledge that while we're sitting here talking about clinical trials, there's a huge number of teams that go into this that do incredibly important work that you may never meet or see, and we could not do this without them. So want to just give a huge shout out to all the data coordinators, the regulatory people, the people who are making the wheels spin behind the scenes. We couldn't do it without them. But that is why a lot of centers don't have clinical trials, because there's so many people and so much infrastructure involved in making a clinical trial to come to fruition. I will just echo clinical trials, if you have access to them all the time, first line, second line, third line and beyond, early stage disease, late stage disease, interventional trials, non-interventional trials, incredibly important message. We cannot advance treatment if we do not have clinical trials.
Thank you, Christine. There's no such thing as deviating from this, so please, whatever. Yes, Tom.
I have nothing.
Oh, I thought you were raising your hand.
No.
So, but Tom, we're going to stick with you because I know you see a lot of patients in consultation. When patients come in, are they asking about clinical trials? Do they already sort of have a knowledge, or does that fall on you as the second opinion?
Excuse me. It totally depends, because I think that we are seeing patients who are very educated through your Facebook group and other things, and hearing about the Nuvalent trial and other things, and they come in very prepared, and that's I think it makes the conversation very easy. But there's also another huge group of patients who don't even understand the basics of a clinical trial, and those take more education. I would say no. I tell patients this, like getting someone on a clinical trial is like dealing with the IRS. You have to check every single box, and if you deviate a little, there are problems. And so I think, like your experience, it often will take a couple weeks to get someone onto a clinical trial, and all of us on the stage would like to compress that time frame, but it's been very hard. And so I think those are some of the thoughts with clinical trials. Other thoughts are, I'm not sure if they can form consent form, which is intended to protect patients. Sometimes some can get bogged down in the 28 or 35 pages of the consent form, and I do think that that's a barrier that collectively we need to address.
It's good to have people to help out and read when you have a consent form. That's extensive, and it's important you know what's in it. Yeah. Because it doesn't just tell you about safety and efficacy, it also tells you, are they going to reimburse you money for your time and effort you put in being on a trial?
Yeah, I think that's really important, and we have a lot of people traveling hours to visit us, and those expenses of being seen really can add up. And if you're going on a trial, I do encourage you all to ask that question up front, because I think it's very important when you think about the logistics. We've also been able to draw labs, external labs, but that's had its own set of problems, as sometimes you have to make sure you write Bill to Duke in the electronic form and other things, but we're trying to do some decentralization, but I think there's a lot of challenges. But they're very important, like Christine and Stephen said, and so.
So Hatim, how do you decide when to invite someone to a trial versus maybe standard of care?
I think this is an excellent question, because one thing that I reflect upon is when you only have 30, 40 minutes with the patient, how do you convey all of this information? And how do you define, firstly, what is the standard of care and how we can kind of do better than the standard of care? So I think when I discuss with patients all the options, I think some things that are really critical are, in the context of clinical trials, is really trying to kind of educate the patient about how is a trial better than the standard of care. And sometimes actually, there's a good dialogue there with the patient to say, where are there the unmet needs? How is the standard of care performing? This is a good educational pearl on really kind of getting all the information about the standard of care. And then also really defining how one defines their preferences. Is a better medicine there because it has less side effects than a standard of care? Is a better medicine out there because it has a better response than the standard of care? And I think all of these should be vetted before one decides on choosing between a standard of care option or a clinical trial option. The other thing I would say is, different medicines perform differently when they're given either in sequence or in a later line versus a first line. And when one is approaching a clinical trial, it's really kind of being aware or thinking about, why is this trial here for me at this moment in time? Is this pertinent for me now? Is this more pertinent for me later? How do I think about those? And I think it invites a dialogue actually with one's oncologist that really kind of creates, a conversation, and it not being, we have these options, you have to choose between options and go forward, but rather kind of a dialogue of how do we address the unmet needs together, and what are the biggest unmet needs for me with my preferences around how I want to direct my care.
Yeah, Stephen.
Again, I think Hatim's point is really good, and it's, you have to weigh the pros and cons of being on a trial, and it's a little different for everybody. And when you look at the pros and cons, the sort of result of that math, it doesn't matter how I added up. It's really what the patient looks at. I think the pros here are that you're getting potentially a drug that we think is better than the standard of care, sometimes many years before it's publicly available. There are sort of extra people watching over things. I think that's good. And you are advancing the science and helping others. But the cons, while the drug is not going to be provided at any cost, while the drug is provided by the company sponsor, the cost really is the time. 6 hours for an EKG. That's not the longest we've had, and some require overnight stays, some require not just every couple of weeks, but every week, sometimes every day for a few weeks, and so that time, I think, is maybe more precious than the money. So there's a big ask involved with that, extra blood samples, other people you have to meet, people looking into the charts, a lot of inconvenience, and whether that's worth it for that patient. Unfortunately, there are a lot of barriers to it. Cost of travel, as Tom pointed out, is a big one. But for example, if we have to worry about childcare, if someone says, well, I can't be there for 6 hours because I need to pick up my child from school and there's no one else that can do that, or I have to take care of my family member who's ill, then that math might be a little different for someone who is retired and lives across the street from the hospital. So we present the option, but I think it's very important that we say this isn't the only option. And if a patient isn't on the fence about if it's not really right for the patient, we have other options that we go to, and I think it's important that we discuss it, that we present it, that we consider it in the right way. But it's going to be a little different for everybody. I think transparency is really important when you're discussing the trials.
And as I listen to this, it seems to me that clinical trial decision-making is the ultimate in shared decision-making, as we were talking about yesterday. Not just because you have to sign a consent form, but one has to have a really thoughtful dialogue, as both Jeff and Emily pointed out.
Absolutely, and I would say, this is where we treat people, not cancer, right? And you have to be able to gauge the person in front of you, like what are their goals? How are those goals changing? What are their needs? How are those needs changing? I mean, there's no other doctor or care team that you're going to see as much as your oncologist, and there's a reason for that, because it's dynamic and it changes. And I think, especially when you're talking about trials for your first treatment, that is the most complicated, I think, because you're trying to explain what's a CT scan, what's a PET scan, what's biomarker testing, what's standard of care, and then on top of that, all the complexities of a clinical trial. So, I'm just going to be bold and say it's kind of BS that we have 40 minutes to talk to people in their first visit. I could say a lot more about that. I will withhold. But, it's not a one-time conversation, and you shouldn't expect it to be, and we shouldn't expect it to be. It's a conversation that evolves over time, and you shouldn't feel rushed to make a decision either, even though, admittedly, at that first moment of diagnosis, you're like, I got to get on a treatment quickly. But just maybe exhale and take a breath and say, I want to take a minute to find what treatment may work best. Truly, trials are tomorrow's treatment today. There would be no first-line lorlatinib if it wasn't in a trial at some point in time, and that's really the goal of a trial.
So when we were preparing for this, I was meeting with our medical committee to finalize these questions, and Emily, she said, I really want to know, question number 2, how do you react when a patient approaches you about a trial? Is that like encouraging you, or are you thinking, oh no, this is going to take more than 30 or 40 minutes now?
I love it, because I think that half of the conversation's already been completed, right? So then we can really focus on that. So I encourage people to read about what they have, and I think one of the elephant in the room, one of the luxuries we have, because we're all at academic centers, is that we can run late, and we're not seeing 40 patients a day, and I have a much smaller panel than many of my community colleagues, and I think, building on Stephen's thing, that unless academic centers give the extra time to have these conversations in depth, it's really challenging to. That wasn't me. I guess I was the hospital administrator saying that we cut him off. But
Tom just lost his thought.
But I think you do need to be in an environment where the provider and the team can give extra time to really make sure that these are diligently answered.
Thank you, Tom, for your morning entertainment for us. Yeah. So just moving down the line, so Hatim, one of the other questions, so we were looking at the number of trials available to ALK patients. We have, based on Emily's spreadsheet, about 95 around the world. So if you're going to an oncologist and you're exploring clinical trial options, how does any one person know all the options, and how should a patient be advocating for themselves?
No, I think that's an excellent question. And one thing that I will say is the more research you do as patients before coming into the visit about what may be available, I think is going to serve well. I think it creates kind of the infrastructure for really kind of getting into that dialogue in a constructive, quick way. I will say that, as Ken has mentioned, we have many trials, and some trials are more positioned in different ways for different applicability and perhaps even success. And so I would have a very frank conversation with your oncologist to say, what are your opinions about this trial? What do you see as some pros and some cons, some risks and benefits? I think that getting a collective knowledge is actually very helpful. I'll even just kind of frame a personal kind of experience where I wrote a trial for ALK, and through different iterations and even conversations with Ken, about this, we kind of reflected on its applicability, where it was, and ultimately that trial didn't actually move forward, despite all the work that we put initially to create it and kind of get it all through the approval process and everything like this. And so, there's a lot of work that goes in, but not all trials, may be the right ones for you. And having a good dialogue is essential, and perhaps kind of the first kind of step there is on the internet or on available resources or in conversation with other people, trying to get as much information by yourself to then frame that with either your oncologist, perhaps team of oncologists, so that you feel confident about the decision that you're making.
I also think that it's valuable to see someone who lives in the lung cancer space. I think the four of us have the luxury of just focusing on lung cancer. We can really go deep, and this is sort of where we live. If you're a general oncologist, the only cancer doctor in a county, you're responsible for every type of cancer. I think if you ask the four of us, I can certainly speak for myself, what the frontline treatment options are for breast cancer, I can tell you what it was 10 years ago, but I'm not the person to really see for that. If I had a loved one diagnosed with it, I wouldn't be commenting on their care. I'd send them to someone who lives in the breast cancer world, who knows what was presented in Hong Kong yesterday instead of what was taught in a textbook 10 years ago. So because we only focus on lung cancer, we can go really deep. If you look at the phase 3 trials, those have a lot of buzz, those have a lot of attention, those are much more well known. But if you're looking at phase 1 studies, if you're looking for the newest first-in-human trials, you really need someone that focuses on that disease type. So there's space and a need for all different kinds of oncologists, but when you're talking about clinical trials for a specific disease, I think it is worth seeing someone who focuses just on that disease.
And maybe also, sorry, Jeff, did you want to?
So I'd just like to contribute as a member of the Clinical Trials Committee that we have an obligation to educate our doctors as well, because as you say, they don't have access to the resources we do. They don't have the ALK Positive website to study all the time, to learn about all the clinical trials that are available. So I think it behooves us to be educators as well, and to bring them the write-ups and the trial descriptions that might be relevant for ourselves, but also for other ALK patients that they might have.
I just wanted to comment and pivot slightly a little bit, which is trials are not unlimited. So trials have slots. And we may want to put a patient on a trial, but that slot, it's actually almost in a way competitive. Like we fight sometimes to get our patients on these trials because we believe this is the most important thing, and you sometimes make a compelling argument like, hey, I really want this patient to get this slot, and you thinking about it and preparing for it. So I think an important message is, it's not unlimited in terms of a trial, and so thinking that often equates into my conversation with patients as well as, we always have these standard of care options, but this trial may not always be an option on the table for us. So that is an important factor in my mind too. It's like, let's put as many tools in the toolbox as we possibly can. This tool may not always be available to us, so let's use it if it makes sense at this time.
I was following research on why patients choose to go or not go into clinical trials. And for the larger audience here, I think it's about 5% of cancer patients across the country actually go on a trial. So it's a very small proportion, and there's been a lot of attempts to try to boost that. There was a study performed in California where it showed the single most important factor for why a patient goes on a trial is what their interaction with their oncologist. So Stephen's saying, you really should be talking to a thoracic oncologist as a part of your care team to get the big picture. So I had the privilege of visiting Stephen in his office in DC a couple of months ago, and we were chatting, and he said to me, I really believe in clinical trials. In fact, I am the highest enroller in clinical trials at Georgetown. So my question for you, Stephen, is what do you attribute that success to?
Well, I think a lot of it is having the right trials, and I think a lot of what we do is trying to be on the cutting edge to find out what's next, because we have this desire to improve. We know that the treatments we have are much better than what we had at the beginning of our training, but we also see every day that they're not nearly good enough, and so we're always looking for something better, for something more. We're never satisfied with what's out there. We have a lot of wonderful drugs today, but all of them have a lot of room for improvement. You mentioned yourself, the first generation moved on. Now we're at fourth generation drugs, clearly better. We're still losing 30% of the people in the first year. And so there's a lot of room for improvement. The drugs today are amazing. We live in a world of synthetic biology, of medicinal chemistry, where a phase 1 trial today is so different from a phase 1 trial in the 1970s where we were just grinding up sea creatures and plants and seeing what killed cancer cells. This is what we did.
I mean, we're still sort of doing that, Stephen.
A little bit, and there's a role for it, all right? But now we're going into the lab and we're saying, look, here's the protein that's active. Can we design a molecule that binds here and here and here and prevents this protein from folding in a certain way? Chemists spit it out, we give it, and so a lot of times first in human studies, which is most of what the trials that I open, we go in thinking, maybe there's a slight chance it'll work. Nowadays we'd say, oh, this is almost certainly going to work. It was designed to do exactly this with new antibody drug conjugates, with new immunomolecules. There's so much more potential, such a higher ceiling than what we know. And so in many ways today, I think the opposite from the 1970s and 80s in the NCI, I think the unknown is that the ceiling is much higher than what we have, and anything is possible. So I think a lot of it is believing in the studies, getting the right studies that are out there, having the right connections with early drug development, biotech, and really understanding the molecule, and not just saying, all right, what are the options for you? What could you be eligible for? That's not the right approach. It's which of these is the right fit for your cancer and for you, or which of these has the chance to help you the most? And if at the end of that we say, it's standard treatment is the best option for right now, this is the best drug, what I have now is not an upgrade for it, we keep it in our pocket. But in many cases, we have something that has a much higher ceiling, much greater potential, and then we should jump on it. And so I think a lot of it is having the right studies, believing in those studies, understanding what the problem is, and how these drugs can solve it.
Can I piggyback on that a little bit too? Because I think Stephen makes a really good point, which is, we all have to know the patients that we're seeing, right? Because they're, in a very good way in 2025, so many kinds of lung cancer. It's so parsed, and that's what personalized medicine is, right? It's early stage disease, stage 1, like resected, neoadjuvant, adjuvant, localized disease with radiation, metastatic, late line metastatic. I mean, but we can't open every single clinical trial. Resources won't allow us to do that. And so part of our jobs is also like, who are we seeing in our regions? What are the demands in that? And so we're representing best the patients that we serve in our areas.
And then, Christine, then it means that if you don't have the trial, you know your colleagues that do, right?
Right, and I think this is a very important message, and maybe people don't realize this enough, like we all talk to each other a lot, like a lot. We're friends, and we have no problem like sending people to different places and being like, hey, Stephen has the trial, can you go see him, or vice versa. And so there is no ego in like, I don't have it, but I'll send it to you to somebody who does. Because I think we share the goal of like just get the patient to the best therapy that we think is available. And none of us can have every single trial. That's just a fact. It's too resource heavy to open every single trial. And just one other comment too, because I think this is really important, is just in terms of like where are trials, we see this sort of, and appropriately so, more and more our lives are like on demand, right? Amazon brings something to your house and they bring it like same day or the next day. And in the same way, and I don't mean to trivialize it, but cancer centers are pushing their care into the community. So all of us at our centers are seeing, like there used to be like the main hub, like I work at Vanderbilt. Vanderbilt has a massive hospital, like thousands of beds. But now nobody wants to come to the main hospital. Everybody wants to go to the clinics that are local to them. I totally get it. Nobody wants to drive into the city anymore. So there's more and more clinics outside of the city, but those clinics are not going to be the ones that have the clinical trials because it's too resource heavy to have clinical trials. So there's this kind of schism between like, hey, we want to have clinical trials, but the clinical trials are only at the main hub, but we want to send patients into the community. And I think we're trying to wrap our heads around, well, how do we fix this problem? To make sure that patients have access to the cutting-edge clinical trials in the community. And if you look even beyond ALK-positive lung cancer, and you look even beyond lung cancer, the most senior people in the cancer research community, like my former boss and the former NCI director, Kim Rathmel, talks about this all the time. How do we get trials out into the community? And I think this is one of the biggest problems we need to solve collectively, because you cannot deliver state-of-the-art care if you cannot deliver clinical trials to everyone.
Thank you. So moving on now, we'll move on to question 5. So I'm going to start with Tom. Tom, they created this is about where do vaccines fit? And I know this is not an easy question, but you have now a big immunotherapy department. Scott Antonia is now in charge, and they're trying to develop vaccines for cancer. Vaccines, the word vaccine amongst our community engenders a lot of enthusiasm and a lot of energy. And of course, everybody wants a vaccine to get rid of their cancer. what do you think in our current 2025, what's that look like?
Very difficult question, and I think, thanks, Ken. I think when I talk to patients, there's a lot of enthusiasm about these vaccine trials, and I share that enthusiasm as well. I think the challenge has been where do they fit in terms of the patient's disease status? Are they enrolling patients who are controlled disease, and this is meant to augment or prevent resistance or delay progression or potentially eliminate the possibility of progression? The number of slots for many of these vaccine trials were very small because they were sort of safety and feasibility trials. And then I think I've talked to the patients that are sort of ALK-specific vaccine trials where it's really developed with the ALK protein, and more sort of off-the-shelf vaccine trials where maybe the 6 proteins are expressed at a high rate among ALK-positive patients. I think intellectually all of us are supportive of this because I think that the hope is that we can stimulate the immune system and do immune surveillance and eliminate that. But I would say right now these are really safety and feasibility trials, in my opinion. I'll let others weigh in if they think they're, and I think they should be investigated, but I do think that sometimes there's an over-exuberance about what the trials are at this point.
Any other comments on that hard question?
I'll comment. So I'm very honored to be part of the Breakthrough Cancer effort, which is going to be the ALK vaccine, hopefully opening in 2026. And it's an ALK-specific, and it will be an mRNA vaccine. And I'm going to point out Luke over there, who's part of Breakthrough Cancer. Hi, Luke, who's kind of our shepherd for the 9 institutions that are part of this Breakthrough Cancer effort. I think, when we think about cancer vaccines, a vaccine is usually to prevent disease, right? We take a flu vaccine, we take a COVID vaccine to prevent the disease from happening. Asking a vaccine to treat a cancer that's established is a heavy ask. Do I think it's possible? Yes, I do. And we have a long way to go. I'm optimistic. I love the expression, hope, have only positive expectations. So I'm eager for these studies to move forward. It'll require a lot of science, a lot of participation from patients, because what's even more diverse than cancer is our immune systems. And so that is going to require a huge number of sample size, of a lot of patients to understand not just the cancer, but even more importantly, how's the immune system responding to it. I think, what I feel excited about is for ALK specifically, it's not supposed to be there. And so it presents a unique opportunity in the tumor to target something that is not necessary for the normal body to function, and that presents a good opportunity for a vaccine. And the mRNA vaccine in particular is based on an enormous amount of science that went into developing vaccines such as the COVID vaccine. So we'll see how this happens. I also, one more quick comment about this is a very unique opportunity for treating the MRD state. And so we use our drugs to debulk the cancer, really try to kill as many tumor cells as possible to give the vaccine an easier job to do. And so I think this will be over the next decade evolving science, but I'm super excited to see this and many other immune-based strategies move forward.
I think that we all believe in vaccines as a route, and right now I'm working on a peptide vaccine with Benjamin Best. It's not for ALK. We think these are going to be sort of the future of how we treat these cancers, and we've believed this for a long time. It's a lot harder than we thought, a lot harder than treating vaccines for infectious disease because each cancer is a little different, each immune system is a little different. But I just want to mention that while there's a lot of enthusiasm on this panel and in the room for cancer vaccines, see if my mic gets cut off, there's not as much from certain political entities about anything with the word vaccine.
Steve's going to get kicked off Twitter now. You're done.
Let me phrase this carefully. So there are some programs that are developing vaccines that are now not calling them vaccines, and part of it is because they run into the threat of sort of landing in the crosshairs of some misdirected energies of having funding cut or redirected, and I think it's a real threat to the science. So it's just something to keep in mind that there are a lot of external forces that are out of our control directly that are going to have negative impacts, I think.
Yeah, in fact, we, the medical committee, have met with a number of vaccine companies, and almost every one of them said, oh, we're changing our name. We're not calling them vaccines anymore, right? It's that big of an issue. And we're talking big established vaccine companies, not just little biotechs.
Sorry, I know we're going to have a comment later on sort of policy and regulatory stuff, but I will just say from big organizations like ASCO and AACR, and like these are cancer-wide international organizations, just while we're on politics for a minute, without getting into politics, your voices are so much more important than anything else right now, and sharing your stories and talking to your local representatives for whatever you believe, in sharing, hey, the importance of cancer research it is at risk right now. And so I'm looking forward to the session where this is discussed. But even contacting your local and state representatives is incredibly powerful. They are actively looking for patient voices. Big cancer organizations are actively looking for patient voices to share their stories and really help build the momentum for sustaining cancer research in our country.
Great, thank you for sharing. So we'll move on to question 6, and I think this question really appealed to me. It's, why should I, as a patient, remain aware of clinical trial options when I don't really have any idea if and when I'll progress? Right? I'm just wondering, we say, there's 95 trials and it's complicated and all that. So is it really feasible to be sorting through and looking at the ones in your city and area and then discussing with your doctor, or is that something you really wait till your markers go up or your scan changes? Anybody?
I'll take this on, I guess.
An easy one for you, okay.
I think it's valuable to know of what's coming. Like as doctors, we're always thinking of contingency plans, like what happens if the scans. And I think as a patient, it would be good to be informed of the next TKIs or next possibilities to sort of help plan your future, and also so that you have the basic information for when that visit does unfortunately come, that you're not totally taken by shock, and you understand when we start talking about trials what the next steps are. Now, I think the problem I've seen patients struggle with, and I'll let others talk, is clinicaltrials.gov is so rudimentary that it lists like 85 trials, of which 10% apply to you, and so I think we need to get like an AI sorting for clinical trials for patients, I think, or something like that.
Yeah, that would definitely be helpful.
And I will also just say that, often when we think about medicines coming to fruition or coming to availability, we think of just like one trial that led to that. But in fact, for many of the medicines, there's actually many trials that were done with that medicine that ultimately culminated in the approval of the medicine. And so even if it's not applicable for you right at the moment with, say, a progression or something, being aware of which trials are in percolation or at different phases will help, if God forbid something were to happen with progression, that then what to proceed with. And so I think it also kind of goes into this issue about it. How do you keep education persistent, where education is not necessarily just happening at the beginning and at progression? Yeah. It's more of a journey through the process, and by creating that dialogue and keeping that dialogue active, even if the trial isn't one where one may meet eligibility right now, it's something that perhaps will kind of provide that framework or that runway that if it were applicable, you would know how to proceed at that point.
Thank you. In our last 2 minutes, I wanted to just show 2 slides. And the first one is, this kind of information is already up on our website. I think we're going to continue to improve it. But these are sort of 5 ways of helping you look for options for yourself. And the first one is exactly what Jeff said. You've got to have all your documents together. And in fact, many of our advisors have said you should have your documents with you and take them with you when you travel, so that if you were sick or whatever, you'd have the information needed for them to provide the care. And my last slide is this. In preparation for this meeting, And Christine said it really beautifully a little bit ago. Clinical trials are what brought us the 6 approved TKI inhibitors. So I went on and I found all the trials I could find that supported the approval of crizotinib, ceritinib, alectinib, brigatinib, lorlatinib, and ensartinib. And of course, hopefully next year we'll be adding neladalkib to that. But that came out to over 6,500 patients. So over 6,000 ALK patients went on these trials to keep us, this group, alive today. And so what we're emphasizing this is, where possible, we can be a part of these non-interventional, interventional trials to help us get to that cure. That will accelerate it, because without these trials, as Christine said so beautifully, we won't have our 5th generation and our other orthogonal therapies we need to cure this disease. So thank you so much to our panel. It's been really awesome.